Hi, I'm your host, Marlo Lemon, and you're listening to Wild Voice, the podcast where I take this voice of mine and share my wild journey with you. Being widowed at 34 with a 15-month-old, most would see as life ending. And instead, I alchemized it and put life back together, and it became more beautiful and fulfilling than I could have ever imagined. Through this life shift of mine, I realized who I am and what I'm here to do. I'm an intuitive energy healer, and sharing how I view the world is how I help you upgrade your life and alchemize your journey into magic. From day one, I wanted to share my journey, call it intuition, but I knew it was going to do more good out in the world than keeping it to myself. So when I say I've mastered life, that doesn't mean I'm perfect or that life is. I mean, I've mastered the concept of life, and I want to share that with you. It had been days since Bob died, and the sirens were in full effect. People were being notified. The devastation was spreading like a virus. Friends and family were scrambling to get their people to show up for them so they could show up for me. Therapy, hypnotherapy, healer, and medium appointments were in session. I was starting to get ways to work with and through the immediate trauma. I was learning ways to remove power from the visuals that took residence in my brain, while also trying to figure out how I got here. What I was learning quite quickly was that life was trying to tell me something. And what started out as a whisper was now loud and in my fucking face, so it was time to listen. Amongst that work and consciousness, I was talking with mediums who were helping me get some sort of clarity in the spiritual sense. I wanted all the information and in all the forms. I wouldn't say I was eager to communicate or hear things from people that had passed, but I believed in it, and I really only gravitated to people in this field that felt very light and grounded in their delivery. I wasn't Googling 1-800-PSYCHIC to get info, and I was very intentional with what I allowed into my bubble. But being stripped down to the studs, I was only allowing in what resonated with me, and that was things that felt uplifting, light, and expansive, no matter the topic. During this recovery phase, I was trying to organize the to-dos and all the emails flying around of things needing to get done and lawyers I needed to meet with, forms I needed to sign, and establishments that needed to be updated. All while bouquets of flowers were showing up in the apartment and started filling up my parents' house like they had a revolving door. I thought it was so kind and thoughtful for people to show their love in ways they knew how. At the same time, it reminded me that things were very, very bad. Grief flowers get a bad rap, but that's because to have that many flower bouquets in your house arriving in your name means shit is not good. It was a bit awkward to start making some of these calls to businesses, as I know most people don't really know what to do with death. It's hard for everyone. You don't want to say the wrong thing or ask something that makes things worse. You also want the grieving person to know you care. Then on the flip side of being the one with the loss, you go in phases of just wanting to be, and you don't know what that is in any given moment. As you can probably guess, I was a talker. But when I was done talking, I was done, and most likely chose to be alone. I didn't mind talking about things or getting questions. That actually made me feel better. Like I was moving the energy. That can breed a life of its own if it just sits. It's meant to move. Think of it this way. Over half of our bodies are made up of water. Water is meant to move. If it doesn't, and it sits for too long, it sure as hell isn't something we choose to drink or hang out in, right? What we do to move through experiences, loss and grief, for example, doesn't have to be as complicated as we make it. Movement and talking, even if it's to ourselves, it's much more healing than we even know. Something else I've noticed is our loss for what to say or how to respond when it comes to death. The "I'm sorry" and the awkward response of, "It's okay." It's not okay, right? But it is what it is. If I can give any look into my brain and what resonated with me most, it was honesty. Let's just be real. Let's just be real with how we're feeling. This sucks. I don't know exactly what to say, but I love you and I'm here for you. To the point, honest, and genuine, right? That lands much higher and more impactful than anything we think we should say. And one of my faves, that I like to use myself. My heart is with you. I've come to really love that. It means a lot. Our hearts are what we feel with. They guide our intuition. It's what keeps us alive. So if I or someone else tells you their heart's with you, it means I know yours feels broken and it won't be forever. But here's a peace of mind in the meantime. I was coming to the realization with each hour that passed that I had been violently shoved out of my old life. But why? Why was I the one to find Bob? Why was this my story? Why was this Nash's? There were some really big things I was meant to experience, so I could shed light on them and shift in the direction I was meant to. Maybe the universe knew I would share it someday. I had lost my footing along the way of this life, the one I was living, and change wasn't being suggested, it was demanded. I've learned as long as our soul's in it, the universe never lets us truly fall. And what does a fall really mean anyways? If it gets us somewhere better than we were going, which it always does, then is it really called falling? Or maybe more like redirecting? For literal falling, I don't know that really works. I can't imagine saying to Nash when he trips and falls, "Oh, I see you're redirecting." But actually, maybe it can work. Maybe tripping and falling slowed him down so he missed running into the street without looking. Or him seeing why it's important we tie our shoes before we start running. So next time when the stakes are higher, he's already learned the lesson. It's interesting, huh? Well, you just got to look into my brain and heart in real time. You're welcome. I would get answers to a lot of the but why me questions throughout my healing journey, which is an indefinite process that is always in motion, by the way, for all of us. I genuinely wanted to understand why this was happening to me, out of all people. I knew there had to be a purpose. I still feel to this day life is not cruel, not intentionally. There is always a silver lining. There is always an underlying reason that leans towards something more elevated than we have experienced yet. This was the start of my journey of finding it. And now, maybe the start or continued journey for some of you. The thing I could take and run with was that I was Nash's mom. And no matter what was going on, that wasn't changing. So I could count on that as consistency. I could build my framework and day around that much. I needed to start rebuilding with for sures, and being a mom was one of them. I needed little wins to keep making it to the next step in this life process, and getting clear on what I could do was important. The other constant was that I desperately needed answers. My brain needed a story. It needed the blanks filled in. The questions were on a constant loop in my head. Without knowing it, I was looking for relief. My brain was on hyperfocus because it was scared and it didn't know how we got here. So it wasn't clear on how to prevent this from happening again. So it was on overdrive, and in this moment, that looked like getting answers and hearing from everyone and anyone that had contact with Bob over the last week. If you've gotten this far, you know exactly who my wing woman was for all the questions and outreach. But there were times throughout my day that I would take breaks from calls and all the other widow tasks, and I'd go through Bob's phone. I couldn't move past the fact that I didn't know if he went to his therapy appointment that night he died. So with Nash playing with a pile of toys on the apartment floor, my mom just happened to come up and check on us, and I decided to call. I left a message, and she called back shortly after. I was upset and frustrated the more I talked to her. It wasn't her fault. She didn't know Bob. She didn't know what she was walking into. But what threw me most was as I asked detailed questions after telling her what had happened, she seemed shocked. Shocked that this was even a storyline coming across her desk. I knew this wasn't normal for me, or what I knew of in my bubble of life and the people in it. But I was learning quite quickly this wasn't the norm for anyone. This story was leaving even professionals dumbfounded. And I got more and more examples of this as time went on, and even to this day. As you all are hearing this story, I get those same dumbfounded responses. It was confirmed once again when weeks later, a letter was brought to me from my parents, and it was something left on the front door of my and Bob's house. It was during the time everyone was working their butts off to try and sell it. The letter was from the health department. It looked like an eviction notice, as it had been taped to the front door with urgency. I opened it, and it was a letter to Bob, telling him they had been notified of his test results and needed to get in contact with him ASAP. It implied they would do the outreach for him, but they needed to know who he had put at risk to update them of the findings and suggest they get tested themselves. This is how I would have found out if Bob wouldn't have told me. As I read the letter, I just thought, this is part of what Bob was running from. I also imagined if he was still alive and having to call them back, would he have to admit he didn't even know people's names or contact information? What do they do in those circumstances? I right away called the number on the letter and got a lovely woman on the phone. She was very kind and made the conversation and topic easy to discuss. Finally, someone who knew this world as their normal. She mentioned a letter was taped to the door and would continue to be until they had gotten a hold of someone. They tried calling, but obviously Bob hadn't called them back. As I started to explain our story, there was shock when I told her I was calling because Bob had taken his own life. Out of curiosity, as I was in the throes of my detective phase, I said, "Can I ask you a question? How common is this type of story?" She said, "I've been doing this for over 4 years here, but I've been in this line of work for a long time. I'll tell you, it's not rare that I have conversations with men who are married to women that have contracted HIV from sleeping with other men. I'd say about 50% of the wives end up knowing, while the other half are unaware of their behavior completely. This is why we take this so seriously and put ourselves in the middle to have the tough conversations." Then I was kind of dumbfounded. Wait, are you telling me some of these men have you call their wives? And without hesitation, she replied, "Yep." While feeling like she left out, "Can you fucking believe it?" Then for some reason, something I hadn't thought of yet but popped into my head. When you're pregnant, there are so many appointments and so many blood draws and tests and things monitored. And I remembered when I went in for a routine checkup, they said it was a day for running some labs. They ran through what they were testing, and one of the things I heard from the long list was HIV. And of course, it stood out to me. I remember stopping the nurse and being alarmed. I was like, "What? HIV? Why are we testing for that?" The nurse told me, by law, it's required for all pregnant women for safety. It made sense, but to me it was laughable. Of course I don't have HIV. I'm married and I have a husband who loves me dearly. You could probably just pass on that test. Nothing ever came back with any indicators, so I of course never thought anything of it. So I said to the lady on the phone, "Does this have anything to do with why pregnant women are tested for HIV?" With almost disappointment in her voice, she said, "Yes. This is a way to help protect the mom and baby from many ways this can be transmitted, but this sort of lifestyle being one of them." I thought to myself, so this is a thing. There are more people out there like Nash and I that live their lives and they're being put in jeopardy. And they're being put in jeopardy from the one person they expected to be their protector. This has to stop. She continued to say, "I will say I've never gotten a phone call that says the person I'm trying to get a hold of has taken their own life, though. That is in fact rare." I told her Nash and I had been tested and our results were negative and the recheck plan I was scheduled for over the next year. She seemed like my case was an easy one, but the details, she seemed to still be processing. So as I continued to rapid-fire questions that night to the therapist, that now was possibly the last person to have seen Bob before he died, I wanted to know what he said or how he answered questions, or if he said anything regarding details, and with a couple flustered responses back to me, she said the sentence that triggered a fire in my soul, and is probably one of the reasons why I do what I do now, and the reason this podcast even exists. She said, "We made a safety plan." What in the actual fuck? Again? In a smart-ass tone back to her, I said, "Well, he didn't use it." It wasn't her fault. She just met the guy. But she was for sure on the front lines of my frustrations. This is actually a good reminder. Maybe I'll call her and apologize. I was blaming her for the system we have in place itself, the way we navigate mental strength and how we nurture, support, and strengthen it. If you ask me, we have some opportunities to try something new. It's like doing the same thing over and over again, yet expecting a different result. I think that's the definition of insanity, isn't it? As she gave me insight into their appointment and how he acted and responded, I was a bit taken back myself. Bob showed no signs or emotion or expression of harming himself or being hours away from taking his own life. She also had no idea what Bob's normal was. But really, I don't think any of us did, even him. He answered the questions open and honestly and said his goal was to get better and to be able to have time with his son and remedy our relationship. He didn't once say we were separating. I think that realization made this other side of his life his new identity, and that was not something he was willing to accept. I asked her to send me his intake form, not knowing how far that would get me, and she agreed. That's how bad this was. People were doing anything they could to help. I saw the words myself. I saw it in his handwriting. Initially, I felt like he played her, like he played me. At this point, though, I don't think Bob was intentionally playing anyone. He was in survival, and as we know, he felt like that wasn't going too well. It reminds me a bit of how someone who wants to lose weight but is obese. It's really hard to start because we think those small wins don't make a big impact, or they don't have the power or the ability to help move the needle. But it does. There's an art in knowing how to notice the small stuff, to make room for the big. A win itself was that someone met with Bob and was going to take him on as a client. And it wasn't through the free service at the lab that he didn't want to be at. So that was a win. Our conversation before his appointment that night, that was a win. The fact we were even talking and he was getting pictures of Nash, also a win. It's not lost on me that there was a lot for him to tackle. I just think he missed the little stuff and the concept with that acknowledgement that he could bring in bigger shifts and more to feel good about. Bob was stuck between two worlds of wanting to stay and wanting to go. And that flipped like a light switch with the emotional life crisis he was in. There was a piece of me that thought maybe he had already decided he was going to do this. Some say those that choose to take their own life see it as a solution and an end to the pain once they've decided to do it. They get this sense of relief, happiness, and euphoria because they have come up with an answer. The same feeling my brain was looking for. Answers to get relief. Here we wanted the same feeling at the end. We just had two different ways to get there. The fact Easter was less than 24 hours away was weighing on me. I hadn't gotten a single thing for Nash. This was going to be his first Easter, the one he was even really aware of. Obviously, with everything that was going on, I wasn't too worried. I guess you could say it wasn't at the top of my list. But as it got closer, I started to get sad that I hadn't even put in any effort. I wanted Nash to know life keeps moving, and we don't have to show up perfect, but we have to show up. So it was Saturday, and with Par in her usual spot of being by my side, her, my sister, and soon-to-be brother-in-law made a trip to Target for Easter supplies. It was Operation Get Nash an Easter Basket. We walked in, and it was like Easter had been robbed. There were plastic eggs lying loose on empty shelves, and anything that resembled Easter had been wiped out. Well, shit. Time to improvise. As I scurried through the aisles at Target, we all scattered to find our best Easter options. Oddly enough, this was one of the firsts. This was going to be the year of firsts, but this was one of them. I didn't leave the house much in those first couple of days, and I for sure wasn't gleefully spending money at Target for no reason. So this was the first time I had been in Target since Bob died. Now, this seems weird to even make this a talkable event, but firsts were very obvious, even little ones. Did Target know? Did it realize my life was different since they saw me last? I knew I felt different. I think we scoured every aisle and left with goodies that weren't necessarily Easter-themed, but could work. I still couldn't find anything that resembled a basket. Even far-fetched ideas like wicker storage baskets or decorative ones were gone. Like everyone had the same idea as me. Was Easter 2018 the most celebrated Easter in history? I got home, and with Nash still with my parents, I started unpacking the Target bags. But what do I put it all in? I tried a bag, I tried rummaging through bins I had. My brain wasn't really in the creative spirit, so I went with what caught my eye and made the most sense. The wooden remote control holder thingy. It had a handle, and would now be Nash's Easter basket to hold all of his Easter tchotchkes. Easter came and went, and what I'll say, it was a feeling. I will remember it always. It doesn't hold the same weight it used to, but fuck, it was heavy. And not in an obvious on the surface kind of way. It was pretty mellow at our house, and that's not how I would usually describe holidays with my family. And that morning, Nash and I decided to go visit Bob's family over at his brother's house. We hadn't seen them yet since all of this, and it seemed like a good time to just be in the same space with one another. We spent some time there visiting, as Bob's mom was going to be heading back home soon. We took some pictures that day, and when I look back at them, it makes my heart hurt. You can see the pain in our eyes and body, even though we were smiling. It was a hard day for Nash, just being a toddler, but I think it was more than that. I think we underestimate what babies and kids pick up on, even if they can't grasp the concept. They're much more intuitive than we realize. They may not be able to articulate it, but they get it. They get feelings and vibes more than most adults. We got back to my parents, and the day was painful but peaceful. We got to spend time together and just visit and watch Nash open his hoopty Easter baskets, but he didn't notice the difference. And I think he really loved that makeshift Easter basket. I had decided the day prior that I was in fact going to view Bob's body. There were a lot of conversations leading up to this day. He was at the funeral home where he had been transported Thursday night, just in the next town from my parents. My main concern for wrestling with this decision is, would it help or would it hurt more? What I started to realize as I talked it to death with Dr. Nancy and my hypnotherapist and friends and family was that it couldn't get much worse, right? And Dr. Nancy, she mentioned people that have experienced a trauma and seeing a loved one in the way I did, replacing that last image with a different one can be a really beneficial thing. It doesn't erase what I saw, but it could help give my brain another visual to let pop in, and something I could start controlling and redirecting my brain to focus on. So with lots of consideration and deep thought, I decided I was going to do it. From that point forward, I had it on my mind constantly. I was scared. But I also felt like I was making the right choice. I was uneasy, to say the least, and earlier that day, they were requesting clothes for Bob, saying it would help to not have him in the same clothes I found him in. So they suggested clothes I liked of his or something he really liked wearing. I called the funeral home to ask a bunch of questions to feel as prepared as possible. And before I got off the phone, the gal said, "But don't bring pants." I kind of laughed. What? She mentioned that he would be in what would look like a casket, and there would be a blanket covering the bottom half of his body. I was like, oh, that visual just feels weird. But what wasn't weird right now? I walked downstairs into the garage and slowly walked towards a duffel bag of clothes of Bob's. I picked out his denim Levi shirt. It was one he wore often. It screamed Bob. It was just enough cowboy, but also said I live in the city. It was something he wore with slacks, sweatpants, and even as a layer when he would go skiing. It was him. As I went through the bag more, I just slowly stopped as I came to his shirts. I remembered him wearing them, and the memories they had associated with them, and that we weren't going to be making any new memories. Damn you, Bob. I'm literally picking out a shirt to view your body in. What? I slowly brought one of the shirts closer to my face and just smelled it. They still smelled like him. Although I missed him, I knew he wasn't mine anymore, even before all of this. Even though we were legally married, that person I missed, I was going to have missed him regardless. I got the shirt ready and gave it to my dad so he could take it to the funeral home for me. Easter night felt quiet. All the people that were rallying around me were with their families. This day, for some reason, is when I really understood how different life was going to be. Pa and my mom would be texting that night as they planned how the next morning would go, arranging who would pick me up, when they would go, who would watch Nash, and where we'd go after. The next morning, I was told a time and that Par was going to pick me up and take me. I went to get dressed, and funny enough, I was wearing a lot of black lately. Not intentionally, but you could have called me the Lululemon widow. I think I wore everything Lululemon in all black and a pair of high-top gray Vans. And the army green confidence cloak. So once I was dressed, I was ready as I'd ever be. I heard Par making her way up the apartment stairs. She came to the door, looking pregnant as ever. She mentioned my parents were heading there first, and they wanted me to go with her. Bob's mom, his stepdad, his brother, and sister-in-law were planning to be there too. It was a quiet car ride. Lots to process, lots to prepare myself for. We pulled into the parking lot, and I started to feel extremely nervous. As we pulled up, I saw my parents standing outside. I got out, assuming Par would stay in the car for a lot of reasons. 1, I wasn't expecting her to have to see any of this. And 2, she was so pregnant, like due any day. I knew she kept saying she wanted to, but I really didn't want her to have to see this. She had mentioned that the way I described what I found in the garage that day made her feel like she saw it too. So she wanted a different visual as well. I got out of the car and walked over to my parents. It was like we were casing the place. I asked them a million questions. What did it look like in there? Was I going to see him right when I walked in? If not, where was he? My dad and mom had answers for it all. Amongst the managing of chaos the last couple of days, they were compassionate, kind, and present. Everyone was so protective of me and doing anything they could to put me at ease. We talked for a bit longer. Then I took a deep breath and said, I was ready. My dad held the door open and we walked in. I was moving slow and intentional with every step, and gazing as I took in everything around me. My dad held the door open and we walked in. I was moving slow and intentional with every step, and my gaze took in everything around me. We were walking into almost like a waiting area, and I was told Bob was in the room to my right. We had congregated in the entryway, and the door to the viewing room Bob was in, while I was parallel to it. This was the best case scenario, as I didn't have to really have him in view yet. I hadn't been to too many funeral homes, so this experience in general was a new one. It seemed old, but the people running it youthful. For some reason, that threw me off a bit. I was grateful for their kindness and grace when it came to me and my questions and process. As we stood there, Bob's family started coming in. We had been talking quite a bit, so it was a casual hello, but it was quiet, like no one knew how to be. But no one also had the capacity to really think of anything outside of that direct moment. Everyone knew this was hopefully a healing moment for me. So eager and also uneasy, my dad stood in front of the door where Bob would be. My mom was standing next to him. He looked at me with his hands in his jean pockets and his navy windbreaker jacket and with a hat on, said, "Do you want me to go in first?" I shook my head yes, and he did. He turned his back to us and he put his hand on the door handle and walked in with my mom. He was only gone for less than a minute, and they both came back out without much expression on their faces. I was studying both of them. They were calm and seemed unfazed. I was relieved. I quickly asked, "Does it look like him?" I wanted my dad to look first in case Bob looked like a scary version of him. I guess more dead and unlike him than what I had seen days ago. I think I was picturing what you would see in a horror movie. He looked at me and nodded his head. It looks like him. How he was acting led me to believe I had made the right choice. When we got there, they made sure to tell me we had less than an hour, so to take my time, but also know that time was limited. A dead body can only be out of the freezer and its preservation for less than an hour before the composition starts to change. Well, I sure as shit didn't want any part of that, so I took a deep breath and said I was ready. What I didn't know was that one of the many side conversations my parents had with Par was there was a big fear I would pass out. It made sense later when I realized how quickly my dad and Par came to either side of me once I said I was ready. My mom stood at the door ready to open it, with my dad on my right side linking arms with me, as if to be prepared to prop me up, and Par swooped in on my left. As I made it closer to the door, I took another deep breath and prepared myself. To be honest, no clue for what. This was such fucking new territory. My mom swung the door open and walked in as she stepped out of the doorway and made her way off to the left. I was left standing there with a complete view of Bob. There he was, straight in front of me, laying in what looked like a casket with a red velvet blanket over his bottom half. In his denim shirt, with the white V-neck I had picked out underneath it, his hands were clasped on his chest and his wedding ring in clear view. Through all of this, he hadn't taken it off. Mine wasn't on the day I got that phone call from him when he told me he had HIV, because I hadn't even left the house yet. But from that day forward, it never went back on. I froze, with panic and a pit in my stomach, leaned back as if I was a toddler digging my heels in the sand to say I wasn't going a step further. To get Bob out of view, I looked over to my left. I looked at the wall and started crying and repeating out loud, "It doesn't look like him. It doesn't look like him." I kept repeating it over and over again as if I had been fooled. I knew that wasn't the case. But his skin color was much lighter, and it had a greenish yellow tone to it, and I could see the rope marks on his neck. I didn't leave the room, but I still wasn't sure I had made the right decision either. Holding back tears with my lips pursed, I just kept shaking my head with tears running down my face, looking down at the ground. I wouldn't look over in his direction. Par and my dad just kept telling me to take my time. Then after some deep breaths, I started slowly lifting my head. I stood there now, just staring at him. I was standing in front of my husband, scared to death, and he was dead. As minutes passed, my mom stopped observing me and started walking closer to Bob and got up by his head. She turned back and said, "Come up here. It looks more like him from this angle, the closer you get." She waved us over as if to have my dad and Par hand me off. I was reluctant, but had caught my breath and was ready to try anything. I inched forward with the tiniest steps, like I had to recalibrate and get my balance with each inch I moved forward before I would even continue. I noticed as I got closer, she was right. His coloring started to not be so obvious, and looking at him from the top of his head instead of from the side was better. She said, "See? Just looks like he's sleeping." I felt like a baby being consoled, but an adult version. I started to agree with her, and my body started to relax, and my breath started to come back. Still not standing as close to Bob as my mom was, I stood there for a minute, unlocking arms with Par and my dad, and my mom held out her hand, as if she was taking it from here. I grabbed her hand and I stood next to her as she whispered, "Hi, Bobby." She put her hand out to touch him, and I started to panic again. My heart felt like it was in my throat, and it was hard to breathe. But it was short-lived. By the time her hand landed on the top of his head, I could see nothing terrible was happening. I started to relax again, and as she started rubbing his hair, she was smiling, that closed-mouth smile, the one I told you we were all going to get really used to. And she told me to do the same, that it felt like his hair. As silly as that sounds, I wasn't sure if it would feel the same. When someone dies, everything changes. Why would anything feel familiar? I was extremely hesitant, but my mom had this calmness to her that, to be honest, I had never seen at this level before. So I knew if she was calm, I was going to be okay. I could follow suit. A little lesson I got the chance to learn for parenting. Our kids look to us for everything, even when we think they don't. And although it's okay to have genuine emotion and share that vulnerability and honesty with them, I think we just tend to underestimate our power and our ability to help calm them by leading by example. I went to put my hand out and it was shaky and moving incredibly slow. I would get close, then pull it away and start the process all over again until my hand finally touched the top of his head. It was cold, like a refrigerator type of cold. I rubbed my hand over the top of his head, over his hair, and she was right. It did feel like him still. Cold, but him. Bob had a thinning spot on the top of his head that he was very self-conscious about. In that moment, I said to them, through tears and my hand on the top of his head, He would be so upset to know this is the angle we were all hanging out at, out of all places. We all laughed through tears and it lightened the mood. But the longer I was in there, the more I missed him. Bob, why did you have to leave? Why couldn't you have seen we could get through this? You left me. You weren't supposed to leave. Remember that day we got married? And we made a deal. And you didn't keep your promise. I miss you so much. So much that I'm not even mad. Nash and I need you more than ever. We needed you to stay and help fix this. I know you think this is how you fixed it, by removing what you felt was the problem. You thought you were making the pain stop. But the pain stopped for you that day, and it transferred to us. I miss my best friend, and I'm so sad Nash is at home being babysat and playing outside, and I'm here. Everything aside, I missed my friend a lot. Looking at him laying there was so final, yet I felt close to him at the same time, like he wasn't quite gone yet. Every part of my life from the time I was 21 had Bob in it, and now life was so very different. And I felt like a piece of my heart left with him. It came back, because it actually never left, but it sure felt like it. As the mood in the room lightened, we all were close to Bob's body and just standing over him. I couldn't take my eyes off of his hands and the fact his wedding ring was still on. Was this his way of saying he never wanted this to be over? Was this his way of saying I was the love of his life and he was refusing how quickly life was changing? I just took in every part of being close to him as it started to feel more normal the longer we were there. I wanted to touch his hand, so as I did with the top of his head, I slowly, but eventually, put my hand on his. It was ice cold. It felt like a prop. Then to our right, on the wall, was a big black spider crawling up the ceiling. We all noticed it, and my mom laughed and said, "Bobby, get up and get that damn spider." In our house, spiders were the creepiest thing, and he was the spider catcher. To the point he'd come home from work sometimes, and I would just have cups all over the floor because I had captured spiders, but no way in hell was I getting close to them. So as more time passed, we told a few more stories. They asked me if I wanted to be alone. With how I started this viewing, you would have thought, hell no. But knowing time was counting down and there were other people that deserved time, I said yes. I asked them to keep the door cracked and to not close it all the way. And once they were out of the room, I just kept staring. I put my hand on his head and rubbed the top of it again. Tears started to well up in my eyes. As they filled up in my eyes and poured down my cheek, I just shook my head. And I said out loud in a whisper, "Bob, I'm going to need you to watch over us. I'm going to need you to protect Nash. And I'm going to need you to not scare me." As I stood there saying my final goodbyes to Bob, I really didn't want to leave. I could have stayed in that room all day, but I knew that would be weird. And honestly, it was just that realization that this was so final. I had decided to cremate him, so as morbid and disturbing as that idea is, I knew I was never going to see him again. This was it. My hand on his head, I told him, "I love you, and I will miss you forever." As I went to leave the room, I didn't want to turn my back to him. It was a huge pet peeve of his, but more so because I didn't want to lose a second. I slowly walked backwards with my hands behind me to catch the door handle before running into it. And as I got to the door, with my hand behind my back and it gripping the handle, I took one last look at him and I whispered, "I love you. Goodbye." I blew him a kiss and walked out the door. Thanks so much for being here. Please rate, like, share, and review so we can stay connected and continue this magical journey together.